24 months. 24 months Ellen Lisbeth had been erasing herself from John Rayburn's world. Her hands scrubbed blood from silk shirts that cost more than her annual rent. Pressed creases into trousers sharper than the edges of the life she was trying to outrun. Polished mirrors in which she had learned never to meet her own eyes. The Rayburn estate consumed an entire city block of the financial district. All black granite and bulletproof glass and security cameras that watched a city where Ellen could barely afford a fourth-floor walk-up with a broken radiator. John Rayburn was a silence she had learned to anticipate. Hearing the distinctive click of his Berluti Oxfords on marble, 3 seconds of warning, she knew to evaporate into the service corridors. Catching glimpses through half-open doors, dark suits that moved like armor, a platinum watch that caught light like a threat, slate-gray eyes that had never once acknowledged her existence. Her job was to be invisible, and invisibility had become her religion. Welcome back, my beautiful family. Before we begin, please click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. $247,000 in debt does not disappear on its own. Her daughter Clara had been born with a heart that beat irregularly, a waltz when it should march. 5 years of specialists telling Ellen the same thing in different words. Surgery or a slow fade into nothing. $174,000 and climbing for a surgery scheduled in 8 months that Ellen would never be able to afford. Then the payday loans, 3 of them stacked like dominoes, each one taken to pay the interest on the last. 22% interest compounding weekly. Another $73,000 that grew faster than she could earn. Ellen signed documents she didn't fully understand. Accepted terms that would follow her daughter into adulthood. Learned to survive on stolen sleep and the arithmetic of desperation. She worked 4 jobs. 4:30 in the morning she woke in darkness. 5 o'clock she arrived at the Rayburn estate for laundry prep. 2 o'clock in the afternoon she left to collect Clara from school. 4 o'clock in the evening she started her waitress shift at Carbone until 11 o'clock. Tuesdays and Thursdays she added overnight inventory work at the garment district. She slept in taxi rides, ate expired yogurt from the restaurant kitchen, drank coffee until her hands trembled. 3 hours of sleep each night if Clara didn't wake with nightmares. Her body ran on caffeine and the kind of love that felt like drowning. Guilt for every bill she couldn't pay. Guilt for every meal that was pasta again. Guilt for the way Clara had stopped asking for things because she had learned what "we can't afford it" sounded like. That Tuesday evening, the grandfather clock in Rayburn's entrance hall chimed 6 as Ellen loaded the last bundle of dry cleaning into her canvas cart. March in New York meant the cold lingered and darkness came too early for comfort. Through the estate's fortress windows, she watched sleet begin to silver the courtyard. Marcus, Rayburn's head of security, offered to have a driver take her to the cleaner's drop-off. Ellen declined. She had a shift at Carbone at 7. She couldn't afford the debt of favors. She tied her red scarf, the only spot of color she allowed herself, tight against the wind and started walking. 6 blocks, just 6 blocks from the Rayburn estate to Wong's 24-hour cleaners. She had walked it hundreds of times with thousands of dollars of Rayburn's wardrobe balanced on her cart. This neighborhood was supposed to be untouchable. This was Rayburn's domain where even the street dealers paid tribute. But tonight the sidewalks were emptier than usual. Most storefronts had shuttered early, only the blue glow of security lights turning everything ghostly. Her cart rattled over uneven pavement, the sound too loud in the strange quiet. She kept her head down, too exhausted to be afraid, feet moving on autopilot, mind already calculating if she could pick up Clara 20 minutes late without the aftercare charging overtime. The loading dock appeared on her right, a concrete throat between 2 buildings where delivery trucks usually idled. She had passed it 1,000 times without a second thought. But tonight, 3 figures stepped out from the shadows, forming a loose semicircle that cut off the sidewalk ahead. Ellen stopped, her hands tightening on the cart handle, heart suddenly loud in her ears. Evening, one of them said. South Boston accent, shaved head, a tattoo of a viper crawling up from his collar. His companions were younger, hungrier, silent. Alan tried to angle the cart around them, but the first man shifted, blocking her path with his body. That's a lot of expensive shit you're hauling. Were you headed with Rayburn's wardrobe? Her voice came out steadier than her hands felt. Just doing my job. Please let me pass. The man's smile was a slash across his face, nothing warm in it. See, that's the problem. Your job. You work for the Iron Boss. Alan stepped back, the cart between them now, a flimsy barrier of metal and fabric. I'm just the laundry service. I don't know anything about his business. The man looked at his companions, something dark and satisfied passing between them. Vane sends his regards. Tell Rayburn he's gotten soft, hiring women to do his bitch work. The first man grabbed the cart, wrenching it from her hands and sending Armani and Tom Ford spilling onto the wet concrete. Before Alan could think to run, his fist connected with her temple. The world tilted, pain blooming white and electric behind her eyes. She staggered, her red scarf coming loose, and then the second man was on her, his boot catching her ribs with a crack she felt in her teeth. They didn't want her dead. They wanted her broken. Wanted her to crawl back to Rayburn's gates as a message written in bruises and blood. The third man pulled out his phone, recording, laughing as the first man grabbed her by the hair and slammed her face against the brick wall of the loading dock. Alan's nose shattered, hot copper flooding her mouth. Her vision swam, consciousness flickering like a dying bulb. She heard them talking but couldn't make out words anymore, just sounds, brutal and distant. Then they were gone, their laughter echoing down the alley, and she was alone with the scattered clothes and the taste of her own failure. Alan didn't know how long she lay there. Minutes. Hours. Time had become something slippery. But Clara needed to be picked up. Clara needed dinner and her medication and someone to check her homework. Alan pushed herself up on trembling arms, gasping at the knife-edge pain in her ribs. Her right eye was already swelling shut. Blood dripped from her nose, her lip, somewhere in her hairline. She couldn't go to a hospital. Couldn't afford it. Couldn't risk losing the hours. She gathered what clothes she could reach, stuffing them back into the cart with shaking hands, leaving the ones too far, too ruined. She had to get them back to the estate. Had to finish the job. Had to keep moving or she would collapse completely. The walk back took forever. Every step was agony. She kept her head down, praying no one would look at her too closely, that the dark and the sleet would hide the worst of it. The estate service entrance loomed ahead, that familiar black door she had entered 1,000 times. Alan punched in her code with bloody fingers, stumbled inside, let the door close behind her with a pneumatic hiss. The service elevator was waiting, doors open like a mouth. She pushed the cart inside and pressed the button for the sub-basement laundry. Just had to make it downstairs. Just had to get the clothes sorted and hung. Then she could go. Then she could get to Clara. The elevator lurched upward instead of down. Alan's stomach dropped. Wrong button. She had hit the wrong button in her days. The numbers climbed. 3rd floor. 4th. 5th. Penthouse. Rayburn's private floor. The floor she was never ever supposed to access. The doors opened with a soft chime. John Rayburn stood 3 feet away, still in his suit from whatever meeting had kept him late, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand. His eyes landed on her, and for the first time in 24 months, Alan Lisbeth was not invisible. His expression didn't change, didn't soften, but something in his absolute stillness made the air in the elevator feel thin. He looked at her face, at the blood soaking her collar, at the red scarf tangled around her neck like a wound. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet it was almost gentle. Almost. Who did this to you? Alan opened her mouth but no sound came out. Her throat had closed around the words, around the terror of being seen like this, of being a problem he would need to solve by removing her entirely. She pressed herself against the back wall of the elevator, the cart between them as if metal and fabric could protect her from whatever came next. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, wet. "Wrong floor. I'll go. I'll just..." She reached for the button panel but her hand wouldn't cooperate, fingers clumsy and swollen. Rayburn moved then, not toward her but past her, stepping into the elevator. He pressed a button and the doors slid shut, sealing them in together. Ellen's heart hammered against her cracked ribs. He was going to kill her. He was going to make her disappear for bringing violence to his doorstep, for bleeding in his private elevator, for being stupid enough to get caught by his enemies. "Who did this to you?" he asked again, and this time there was something underneath the quiet, something vast and cold like ice cracking over deep water. Ellen shook her head, the movement sending fresh pain spiking through her skull. "I don't know. I didn't see. I need to go. My daughter needs..." Her knees buckled. She didn't fall so much as crumple, the adrenaline that had carried her this far finally burning out. Rayburn caught her before she hit the ground. One arm around her waist, the other behind her shoulders, the whiskey tumbler hitting the elevator floor and shattering into amber glass. Ellen tried to pull away but his grip was iron, impersonal, the way someone might hold a wounded animal. "Don't," she managed, but he wasn't listening. He lifted her fully into his arms, one arm beneath her knees, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. The elevator began to rise again back toward the penthouse. Ellen's vision blurred, consciousness slipping. "Please. I can't lose this job. I'll clean it up. I'll pay for the glass. Please don't fire me." Rayburn said nothing. The elevator doors opened onto his private floor, a space Ellen had only ever seen in glimpses, all dark wood and leather and windows that overlooked a city of glittering lights. He carried her through the foyer, past furniture that cost more than her life, down a hallway lined with art she couldn't name. She tried to protest again but the words came out as a whimper. He shouldered open a door and the room beyond was massive, dominated by a bed the size of her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A bathroom visible through an open doorway, all black marble and gold fixtures. Rayburn laid her down on the bed with a gentleness that didn't match anything she knew about him. The sheets were charcoal silk, softer than anything Ellen had ever touched, and she was ruining them with blood and sleet and the grime of the loading dock floor. "I'm sorry," she said again because it was the only thing she knew how to say. "I'm getting it dirty." Rayburn straightened, looking down at her with those slate-gray eyes that had never once seen her before tonight and now couldn't look away. "Be quiet." It wasn't cruel. It was a command, flat and absolute. He pulled out his phone, dialed, spoke in a voice too low for Ellen to hear. She caught fragments. "No. Private." Then he was moving again, disappearing into the bathroom and returning with a towel, warm and damp. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, and reached for her face. Ellen flinched. He paused, hand hovering an inch from her cheekbone, and something flickered across his expression. Impatience maybe. Or something darker. "I'm not going to hurt you." Ellen didn't believe him but she didn't have the strength to fight. He cleaned the blood from her face with a precision that spoke of experience, each movement careful and methodical. She watched him through her one good eye, this man who commanded fear the way other men commanded respect, and tried to understand what was happening. Why he hadn't thrown her out. Why his hands weren't rough. Why he looked at the split in her lip and the bruising around her eye socket like someone had just declared war on everything he owned. "They said vain," Ellen whispered, because maybe if she gave him what he wanted he would let her go. "They said to tell you he sends his regards. That you've gotten soft." Rayburn's hand stilled against her temple. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he looked at her again, his eyes were empty in a way that was worse than anger. "Did they touch you anywhere else?" Ellen nodded toward her ribs. He set the towel aside and reached for the hem of her blood-stained work shirt, then stopped, hand hovering. Waiting. Ellen couldn't read the gesture at first, couldn't process it. Then she understood. He was asking permission. The iron boss of the city's underworld was asking a cleaning woman for permission to check her injuries. She nodded, too stunned to do anything else. He lifted her shirt with the same impersonal efficiency he'd used on her face, revealing the bruising already blooming purple and black across her ribcage. His jaw tightened, the only visible reaction, and then he was pulling her shirt back down and standing. "You'll stay here until the doctor clears you. You don't leave this room. You don't contact anyone. Do you understand?" Alan tried to sit up, panic flooding back. "My daughter. Clara. She's at aftercare. I have to, where?" The question was a knife. Alan told him the address, the words tumbling out. Rayburn made another call, this one briefer, giving orders in that same flat voice. "She'll be picked up in 10 minutes. Brought here. She'll be safe." Alan stared at him, this stranger who had never looked at her before tonight and was now pulling apart her entire life with terrifying efficiency. "Why are you doing this?" Rayburn looked at her for a long moment and she couldn't read what she saw there. Couldn't tell if it was rage or something else entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft again, that dangerous softness that made her ribs ache for entirely different reasons. "Because you're mine to protect. You work for me. You bleed in my territory. That makes you mine." He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "And because anyone who touches what's mine doesn't get to keep breathing." The door closed behind him with a whisper of sound, and Alan was alone in the Iron Boss's bed, drowning in silk sheets and the realization that her invisibility had just shattered completely, and nothing would ever be the same. The war room in Rayburn's estate had no windows. Just walls lined with monitors showing every corner of his territory, from the loading docks at the waterfront to the high-rise penthouses where deals were brokered over cigars worth more than most men's monthly salaries. Alan had never seen this room before tonight. She wasn't supposed to see it now. But the Dr. Rayburn had summoned, a thin woman with surgical precision in her movements, had insisted Alan's ribs were only bruised, not broken, and that she could walk if she moved carefully. Clara had arrived 20 minutes later, delivered by one of Rayburn's drivers, her eyes wide with confusion and fear until she saw Alan alive and mostly whole. Now Clara slept in an adjacent guest room, curled under blankets that cost more than their rent, and Alan sat in a leather chair too expensive for her blood-stained clothes, watching John Rayburn dismantle a city. He stood at the head of a table surrounded by 7 men, each one radiating the kind of danger that made people cross streets and avoid eye contact. His lieutenants. Alan recognized Marcus from the estate's security. The others were strangers, but their body language told her everything. They feared him, respected him, would kill for him without question. Rayburn hadn't looked at Alan since bringing her to this room. Hadn't explained why she was here witnessing this. She wondered if it was intentional, if he wanted her to see what he was capable of, what her pain had unleashed. 3 men, Rayburn said, his voice carrying that same terrible quiet from the elevator. South Boston accents. One with a viper tattoo on his neck. They were waiting outside Wong's Cleaners between 6:15 and 6:30 Tuesday evening. They mentioned Vane by name. He placed his phone on the table and Alan realized with ice-cold clarity that he had already pulled the security footage from every camera in a 6-block radius. The screens on the wall flickered, showing grainy images of the loading dock, of 3 figures stepping from the shadows, of Alan's cart being overturned. Marcus leaned forward, his face carved from granite. Vane's been quiet for 8 months. This is a declaration. Rayburn's hand rested on the table, fingers splayed, the platinum watch on his wrist catching the blue light from the monitors. This is a mistake. Another lieutenant, older with silver threading his temples, spoke carefully. We hit back at the Vane operations. Take out their distribution in Brooklyn, send a message. No, Rayburn said, and the single word carried the weight of an execution. We don't send a message. We erase the message. I want every port, every tunnel, every bridge into this city locked down. Nothing moves. No shipments in or out. No product, no money, no people. The city stops breathing until I have those 3 men and everyone who gave the order. The room went silent. Ellen watched the lieutenants exchange glances, and she understood what Rayburn was proposing. A complete shutdown. The kind of move that would cost millions in lost revenue, that would bring every criminal operation in the city to a grinding halt, that would make enemies of allies who depended on commerce to survive. Marcus cleared his throat. That scorched earth, boss. We'll have every crew from here to Queens demanding answers. Our own people will start bleeding money. Rayburn finally turned, his eyes finding Ellen across the room, and the look in them made her breath catch. Let them bleed. He looked back at his lieutenants and his voice dropped to something even quieter, even more dangerous. Put out the word. $1 million for information leading to the 3 men who did this. $2 million for the men themselves alive. $5 million for whoever in Vane's organization authorized it. The numbers hit like physical blows. Ellen's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. $5 million. For her. For the woman who scrubbed his floors and had been worth nothing more than her labor until tonight. Another lieutenant, younger with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, spoke up. That kind of bounty will start a feeding frenzy. Every 2-bit hustler in the city will be turning over rocks. Good, Rayburn said. I want them afraid. I want them to understand that touching anyone under my protection costs more than they can afford to pay. He pulled out his phone again, typed something, and every screen in the room lit up with the same message. Ellen could read it even from her chair. 3 men. Vane affiliated. Attacked my employee. $1 million information. $2 million delivery. $5 million authorization. The city is closed until I have them. No exceptions. Marcus whistled low. You're really doing this. I'm really doing this, Rayburn confirmed. He looked at the man with the silver temples. Call every crew boss we have agreements with. Tell them the ports are frozen as of midnight. Tell them why. Tell them it stays frozen until those men are bleeding on my floor. The older man nodded and pulled out his phone. The others followed suit, the room filling with low voices making calls, sending messages, activating a network that stretched from the financial district to the industrial wastelands at the city's edge. Ellen watched it happen in real time on the monitors. Trucks idling at loading zones suddenly stopping. Warehouse doors rolling shut. Ships that had been scheduled to dock tonight sitting dark in the harbor. The city's underground economy, the machinery that moved millions in cash and product every night, grinding to a complete halt. All because 3 men had put their hands on a cleaning woman in a loading dock. All because John Rayburn had looked at her bruised face and decided the world needed to stop until someone paid for it. Rayburn dismissed his lieutenants with a gesture. They filed out silently, already on their phones, already spreading the word that would ripple through every dark corner of the city by dawn. When the last one left, closing the door behind him, Rayburn finally walked over to where Ellen sat frozen. He stopped in front of her chair, looking down, and she realized his hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough to betray that the terrible calm was a mask over something vast and violent. You didn't have to do this, Ellen whispered. Her voice sounded small in the enormous room. I'm nobody. I'm just, you're not nobody, Rayburn interrupted, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that scared her more than the quiet had. Not anymore. Not to me. He crouched down so they were eye level, his hands resting on the armrests of her chair, caging her in. They wanted to send me a message by hurting you. So I'm sending one back. Anyone who touches you answers to me. Anyone who makes you bleed pays with everything they have. Ellen stared at him, at this man who had never seen her until tonight and was now burning the city down in her name. I don't understand why. Rayburn's smile was a knife edge in the dark. You will. Clara woke screaming at 3 o'clock in the morning. Ellen heard it through the walls of Rayburn's penthouse, that particular pitch of terror that meant nightmare, not pain, and her body moved before her mind caught up. She was out of the guest bed, ribs protesting, stumbling down the hallway in borrowed clothes too big for her frame. She found Clara sitting bolt upright in the massive bed, small hands clutching sheets, her face slick with tears. "Mama," she gasped, and Alan was there, gathering her daughter against her chest, whispering the things she always whispered. "You're safe. I'm here. It was just a dream." Clara's heart hammered against Alan's palm, that irregular rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing, the waltz that should have been a march. Alan counted the beats the way she always did, waiting for the pattern to settle, for the panic to ease. She didn't hear Rayburn enter the room. Didn't know he was there until Clara's breathing had calmed and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway, perfectly still, watching them with an expression she couldn't decipher. "I'm sorry," Alan said automatically, the apology rising like reflex. "She has nightmares sometimes. I'll keep her quiet." Rayburn said nothing. His eyes moved from Alan to Clara, to the small girl with braids coming loose and a Goodwill nightgown that had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent. Clara stared back at him with the wide-eyed wariness of a child who had learned early that strange men were threats to be assessed. "Who's that?" she whispered against Alan's shoulder. "That's Mr. Rayburn," Alan said carefully. "He's helping us right now." Clara processed this with the gravity of someone far older than 5. "Is he the one who hurt you?" The question hit the room like a gunshot. Alan felt Rayburn's stillness sharpen into something else, something that might have been offense or might have been pain. "No, baby. He's the one who's keeping us safe." Rayburn moved then, crossing the room with that deliberate precision Alan had learned to track through walls. He crouched down beside the bed, putting himself at Clara's eye level, and Alan's arms tightened instinctively around her daughter. "What's your name?" His voice had changed, lost some of its edge, though the quiet remained. Clara looked at Alan for permission. Alan nodded, not trusting her voice. "Clara. Clara," Rayburn repeated as if testing the weight of it. "That's a strong name." Clara tilted her head, studying him with the blunt honesty children hadn't learned to hide yet. "You're scary." Rayburn's mouth twitched, something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't entirely cold either. "I know." He stood and Alan watched him look at the room properly for the first time, seeing what she saw. The medications lined up on the nightstand, their labels a catalog of cardiac terms. The pulse oximeter Clara wore on her finger, the red light blinking softly in the dark. The inhaler. The carefully maintained calm that could shatter if her heart decided to skip one too many beats. Rayburn's gaze returned to Ellen, and she saw the exact moment he understood. Saw the calculation happening behind those slate-gray eyes, the pieces falling into place. "How long?" His voice had gone quiet again, but this was different than before. This was the quiet of someone trying very hard not to break something. Ellen knew what he was asking. 5 years. Since she was born. The surgery? Ellen looked down at Clara, who had started to drowse against her chest, exhausted by the adrenaline crash. She kept her voice low. 8 months. It was 8 months. But now, she stopped because now was complicated. Now she'd missed her shift at Carbone. Now she didn't know if her other jobs would wait. Now she was in a penthouse with a man who'd frozen an entire city and she didn't know what any of it cost. Rayburn pulled out his phone, typed something. "What's the surgeon's name?" Ellen told him, because refusing felt impossible because she was too tired to do anything but comply. He made a call right there in Clara's room at 3 o'clock in the morning, speaking in that same flat voice he'd used with his lieutenants. Ellen caught fragments. Pediatric cardiac specialist. Immediate scheduling. Money no object. Full private suite at Mount Sinai. He ended the call and looked at Ellen with something that might have been anger or might have been something far more dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was so absurd Ellen almost laughed. "Almost. Tell you what? That I had a sick daughter? You never looked at me. I was the cleaning woman. I wasn't supposed to have a life that mattered to you. Rayburn's jaw tightened. You've been working yourself to death for 2 years in my house and you never said a word. What was I supposed to say? Alan's voice cracked. Exhaustion and fear and 2 years of carrying weight she couldn't put down finally spilling over. That I needed help? That I was drowning? People like you don't help people like me. They just use us until we break and then replace us. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Clara had gone still against Alan's chest, sensing the shift in the air. When Rayburn finally spoke, his voice was so low Alan had to strain to hear it. I would have helped. Alan stared at him. Why? Why would you help someone you never even looked at? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, the words came out like a confession pulled from somewhere deep and unwilling. Because I did look at you. Every day for 2 years. The woman in the red scarf who never asked for anything. Who moved through my house like she was afraid of taking up space. Who looked at me like I was something to be survived. He took a step closer and Alan couldn't move, pinned by his gaze and Clara's weight and the impossibility of what she was hearing. I looked at you, Alan. I just didn't know how to make you see it. The admission hung between them, too large for the room, too raw for the middle of the night. Alan felt something crack open in her chest, something that had nothing to do with bruised ribs and everything to do with the realization that she had been invisible by choice, by necessity, by the learned survival instinct of someone who couldn't afford to be seen. And John Rayburn had seen her anyway. Had been watching her quiet strength while she counted pennies for her daughter's medicine and scrubbed bloodstains from his clothes. Had been waiting, perhaps, for permission to close the distance. The surgery is scheduled for next week, Rayburn said, his voice returning to that terrible calm. Clara will have the best surgeon in the country. You'll both stay here until she's recovered. And when you're ready, we'll discuss what comes next. Alan wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him she couldn't accept this, couldn't owe him what this would cost. But Clara's heart beat its irregular rhythm against her palm, and sometimes survival meant swallowing pride and taking the hand extended, even if that hand belonged to the most dangerous man in the city. Thank you, she whispered, because it was all she had left to give. Rayburn nodded once, then turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with that same whisper of sound. And Alan sat in the dark, holding her daughter, understanding that the price of being seen might be the only thing more terrifying than being invisible. The first body arrived at dawn. Alan didn't see it, but she heard the commotion from the guest room where she'd been pretending to sleep. Voices in the courtyard below, low and urgent. The slam of a car door. Then silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. She found Rayburn in his office an hour later, standing at the windows that overlooked the city, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He didn't turn when she entered, but she knew he'd registered her presence by the slight shift in his shoulders. They found the first one, he said, his voice carrying that terrible calm she was learning to recognize as the precursor to violence. The one with the viper tail. He was trying to board a cargo ship to Boston. Alan moved closer, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. She could see her reflection in the window glass, ghostly and insubstantial next to his solid form. What happened to him? Rayburn took a sip of the cold coffee, grimaced, set it down. He's in the basement. Would you like to see him? The question was delivered like an invitation to dinner, casual and polite, and Alan felt ice slide down her spine. This was a test. She understood that instinctively. He was showing her the monster, giving her the chance to run before she got any deeper into whatever this was becoming. He thought about saying no. Thought about Clara sleeping upstairs with her irregular heartbeat and the surgery scheduled for next week. Thought about the 2 years she'd spent invisible, scrubbing blood from his clothes without asking whose blood it was or why it was there. Yes, she heard herself say. The basement of the Rayburn estate was not the kind of basement where you stored holiday decorations and forgotten furniture. It was concrete and steel, soundproofed, with drains built into the floor and walls that had been hosed down so many times the stone had a permanent dark sheen. The man with the viper tattoo was chained to a chair in the center of the room, his face a geography of bruises, one eye swollen completely shut. He looked up when they entered, and Alan saw the exact moment he recognized her. Saw the fear spike through the pain. Her, Rayburn said, and it wasn't a question. The man nodded, the movement jerky and desperate. It wasn't personal. Vane said to send a message. Said you'd gone soft, needed reminding you weren't untouchable. Rayburn walked in a slow circle around the chair, his hands in his pockets, his expression empty in that way that was worse than rage. Where are the other two? The man's good eye darted to Ellen, then back to Rayburn. I don't know. We scattered after. That was the plan. Hit and run different directions. Wrong answer, Rayburn said and pulled out his phone. He made a call, brief and efficient. Bring in his brother. The man in the chair went rigid. No, he wasn't involved. He doesn't know anything about. Then you'd better start remembering where your friends went, Rayburn interrupted, his voice never rising above that terrible quiet. Because every hour I don't have them, someone you care about disappears. Your brother. Your mother in South Boston. Your ex-girlfriend in Dorchester. The cousin you grew up with in Southie. He leaned down, putting himself at eye level with the man, and Ellen saw the fear that made grown men in this city wake up sweating. I will erase everyone you've ever loved from existence until you give me what I want. Or you can tell me now and only you pay the price. Ellen watched the man break. Watched him give up addresses, names, details spilling out in a desperate cascade. Watched Rayburn listen with that same empty expression, recording everything, making more calls. Within 20 minutes, Marcus and 2 other lieutenants were out the door, hunting the remaining 2 men with the efficiency of wolves who'd caught a scent. Rayburn dismissed the guards who'd been standing silent in the corners, leaving him alone with Ellen and the man in the chair. He turned to her, studying her face in the harsh fluorescent light. You're still here. It wasn't quite a question. Ellen looked at the man in the chair, at the blood on the concrete, at the drains built into the floor for purposes she didn't want to imagine. She thought about the loading dock, about the crack of her ribs and the taste of her own blood, about the way these men had laughed while recording her pain. She thought about Clara upstairs and the surgery that would save her life and the debt Ellen could never repay. She met Rayburn's eyes. I'm still here. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to name. He looked back at the man in the chair, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to a register that raised the hair on Ellen's arms. You put your hands on her. You made her bleed. You filmed it like it was entertainment. He pulled a knife from somewhere Ellen hadn't seen, the blade catching light. I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what that costs. Ellen should have left. Should have walked back upstairs to where Clara slept in silk sheets. Should have closed her ears to what happened next. But she stayed. Stayed because Rayburn had asked if she wanted to see the monster and she'd said yes. Stayed because invisibility was a choice she was tired of making. Stayed because 2 years of scrubbing other people's blood had taught her that violence wasn't something that happened in the abstract. It was concrete and steel and the sound of a man screaming through a gag. She watched Rayburn work with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had done this so many times it had become routine. Watched him extract payment in pain for every bruise on her face, every cracked rib, every moment she'd spent on that loading dock believing she was going to die alone. The man in the chair passed out twice. Rayburn brought him back both times. When it was over, when the man was barely conscious and the concrete around the chair was dark with blood, Rayburn cleaned the knife on a cloth that had been left for exactly this purpose. He looked at Ellen and she saw the question in his eyes. Was she horrified? Was she running? Was this the moment she understood she'd made a deal with something that couldn't be unmade? Ellen walked over to the man in the chair. Looked at his ruined face, at the price Rayburn had extracted in her name. She thought about Clara's heart and the surgery and the invisible life she'd been living. She thought about the red scarf and the 20-hour days and the debt that never stopped growing. Then she looked at Rayburn and said the only thing that made sense in the terrible clarity of this basement with its drains and its soundproofing and its evidence of every other person who'd made the mistake of touching something John Rayburn had decided to protect. Where are the other two? Rayburn's smile was a terrible, beautiful thing. Marcus is bringing them in now. Ellen nodded, understanding settling over her like armor. She'd spent 2 years being invisible, being prey, being something the world could use and discard. But John Rayburn had looked at her and decided she was worth burning a city for. Worth stopping commerce for. Worth showing her the monster he kept locked behind expensive suits and terrible calm. The least she could do was watch him finish what he'd started. The least she could do was stop being a ghost and become something else entirely. Something that matched the woman in the red scarf who'd survived 2 years in the house of the Iron Boss. Something that understood that sometimes love and violence were the same language, spoken by people who'd learned that mercy was a luxury neither of them could afford. "I'll wait upstairs," Ellen said, because Clara would be waking soon and some things a 5-year-old should never see. But she paused at the door, looked back at Rayburn standing in the center of his basement kingdom and added, "Thank you. For protecting her. For seeing her. For showing her exactly what it cost to matter to a man like him." Rayburn nodded once, that same gesture of acknowledgement he'd given in Clara's room. And Ellen climbed the stairs back to the light, leaving the monster to his work, understanding that she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Understanding that she didn't want to. Ellen couldn't lift her right arm above her shoulder. 4 days after the loading dock, and her body was still cataloging the damage in new and inventive ways. Bruises she hadn't noticed before bloomed purple and yellow across her collarbone. Her ribs ached with every breath. The cut above her eyebrow had scabbed over but pulled tight when she tried to smile at Clara over breakfast. She was standing in the bathroom of the guest suite, struggling with the buttons of a borrowed shirt, when Rayburn appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach. Never did. "You need help," he said, and it wasn't a question. Ellen looked at him in the mirror, at this man who 3 days ago had methodically dismantled another human being in a basement while she watched. He was wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, no jacket, no tie. Almost casual, if casual could describe someone who moved through the world like barely contained violence. "I can manage," Ellen lied, because accepting help still felt like admitting weakness, like giving up ground she couldn't afford to lose. Rayburn crossed the bathroom in 3 strides, coming to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the thin fabric of her undershirt. "Your pride is going to rip those stitches," he said, his voice carrying that edge of impatience she'd learned meant he was about to simply do what he wanted regardless of her protests. His hands came up to the buttons she'd been fumbling with and Ellen went rigid. Not from fear exactly but from the strangeness of it. These hands that had held a knife in a basement. These hands that had carried her to his bed when she was broken. These hands that moved now with surprising gentleness, fastening each button with the same precision he applied to everything else. "Breathe," Rayburn said quietly, and Ellen realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, watching in the mirror as he worked his way up the shirt, his fingers never quite touching her skin but close enough that she could feel the almost contact like electricity. When he reached the collar, he paused, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Their eyes met in the mirror. "You're afraid of me," he observed, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Not hurt but something adjacent to it. "I'm afraid of what you make me," Ellen corrected, because that was closer to the truth. "I watched you torture a man and I didn't leave. I didn't even want to leave. What does that make me?" Rayburn turned her around to face him, his hands still on her shoulders, gentle but immovable. "It makes you a survivor. It makes you someone who understands that the world isn't kind to people who refuse to protect themselves." He lifted one hand to her face, his thumb tracing the edge of the bruise on her cheekbone with a touch so light it barely registered. "You think I'm a monster. You're not wrong. But monsters recognize their own, Ellen. And you've been surviving in a world that wanted to break you long before I put you in that basement. Alan should have pulled away. Should have told him he was wrong, that she wasn't like him, that watching violence didn't make her complicit in it. But his touch was doing something strange to her nervous system, short-circuiting the fear and exhaustion and leaving something else in its place. Something that felt dangerously like relief. Like coming home after years of being lost. "I don't understand what you want from me," she whispered. Rayburn's hand moved from her cheek to the nape of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair with that same careful gentleness. "I want you to stop apologizing for taking up space. I want you to stop flinching when I come near you. I want you to understand that you're not a ghost in my house anymore." He guided her out of the bathroom, back to the bedroom where morning light spilled through windows that overlooked a city he'd brought to its knees for her. He sat her down on the edge of the bed and knelt in front of her, a position so unexpected that Alan's breath caught. John Rayburn, the iron boss, on his knees. He took her right arm carefully, examining the bruising around her wrist where she'd tried to block one of the blows. "I've been watching you for longer than 2 years, he said, his voice quiet in the morning stillness. "Closer to 3. Alan stared at him. "What?" Rayburn's fingers moved gently over her wrist, checking the joint, the tendons, making sure nothing was damaged beyond surface bruising. "You started working here 3 years ago. You were different than the others. Quieter. More careful. You never stole anything, never gossiped, never tried to get my attention." He looked up at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes was almost physical. "You treated my house like a war zone to be navigated, and I wondered what had made you so afraid." He released her wrist and reached for the medical supplies on the nightstand, the ones the doctor had left. Antiseptic, bandages, pain medication Alan had been too stubborn to take. 6 months in, you came to work with a black eye. You told Marcus you'd walked into a cabinet. He believed you. I didn't. Alan's heart hammered against her damaged ribs. "What did you do?" Rayburn opened the antiseptic, poured some onto a clean cloth. "I had someone look into it. Found out about the payday loan offices you were using. Found out about their enforcement methods when payments were late." He began cleaning the cut above her eyebrow with movements so gentle they contradicted everything she knew about him. "The man who gave you that black eye doesn't work in collections anymore. He doesn't work anywhere anymore." Alan processed this slowly, her mind catching on the implications. "You had him." "I had him reminded that certain people are off limits," Rayburn interrupted. "That touching you came with consequences he couldn't afford to pay." He finished with the antiseptic and reached for a fresh bandage. "After that, I started watching more carefully. Saw you counting change in the laundry room. Saw you eating vending machine meals. Saw the way you looked at my world like it was something you could never touch." He applied the bandage with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly how much pressure to use. "I wanted to help. Wanted to offer you money, better pay something. But I knew you'd refuse. Knew you'd see it as charity or worse." Alan's throat was tight. "So you just watched?" "I just watched," Rayburn confirmed. "And I made sure no one else touched you. Made sure the loan offices stopped harassing you. Made sure the landlord who kept threatening eviction found better things to do with his time." He sat back on his heels, studying her face. "I've been protecting you from the shadows for a year, Alan. The only difference now is you can see me doing it." The revelation settled over her like weight and weightlessness at the same time. A year. He'd been watching her invisible life for a year, moving pieces she never saw, keeping wolves at bay she never knew were circling. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rayburn stood, offering her his hand to help her up. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have run?" Alan took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, and admitted the truth. "I would have run." He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "You're not running now." It wasn't a question, but Alan answered anyway. "No." She looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his scarred knuckles and her work-roughened fingers. "I'm not running now." Rayburn pulled her closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped back if she'd wanted to. One hand came up to cup her face, tilting her head so she had to meet his eyes. "Good," he said, and the word carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. All the watching and waiting and the careful distance he'd maintained until violence gave him permission to close it. "Because I'm done pretending I don't want you exactly where you are." He kissed her then, carefully, mindful of her split lip and the bruises and the way her body was still healing from what his enemies had done. It was nothing like the violence in the basement. Nothing like the terrible calm he used to dismantle men who crossed him. It was gentle and deliberate and devastating in ways Alan hadn't prepared for. When he pulled back, his thumb traced her jaw with the same tenderness he'd used on her bruises. "Rest," he said, though his voice had roughened with something that had nothing to do with anger. "Clara's surgery is in 3 days. You need to be strong for her." Alan nodded, not trusting her voice. Watched him leave the room with that same controlled grace, closing the door behind him. And she understood finally what it meant to be seen by John Rayburn. Not as a ghost or an employee or someone to be managed, but as something worth protecting, worth watching, worth the kind of patience that could span years and the kind of violence that could level a city. She touched her lips where he'd kissed her, tasted the dangerous promise of what came next, and knew she'd already made her choice. Had made it in the basement, or maybe even before that, in the elevator when he'd looked at her broken face and asked who did this with a voice that promised blood and retribution. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood someone who'd been seen all along, just waiting for permission to step into the light. Even if that light came from a man who kept his monsters in the basement and his mercy locked behind walls of terrible, beautiful violence. Clara's surgery was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning. Alan had laid out the clothes they'd need, packed the small bag with Clara's favorite stuffed rabbit and the medications the hospital had requested. Everything was ready. Everything was under control. Then at 6:47 in the morning, the east window of Clara's room exploded inward in a shower of glass and the world became screaming and chaos and the particular clarity that comes with absolute terror. Alan was in the hallway when it happened, coming back from the kitchen with Clara's breakfast. She heard the glass first, that distinctive crash that meant something irreversible had just occurred. Then Clara's scream, high and piercing and abruptly cut off. Alan dropped the tray and ran, her healing ribs forgotten, adrenaline burning through every other thought except get to Clara now. She burst through the door to find 2 men in tactical gear. One holding Clara against his chest with a hand clamped over her mouth, the other covering the door with a gun. The one holding Clara had rappelled down from the roof, his harness still attached to a line that disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. The second man had come through the window after him, glass crunching under his boots. They'd bypassed Rayburn's security, his cameras, his guards. Had found the one window on the top floor that wasn't reinforced because it was supposed to be impossible to reach. "Don't move," the man with the gun said, his accent thick Brooklyn, and Alan recognized the desperation in his voice. These weren't professionals. These were the remnants of the Vane Syndicate, the survivors of Rayburn's systematic dismantling, men with nothing left to lose and revenge as their only currency. Alan raised her hands slowly, her eyes locked on Clara, whose face had gone pale with terror. "Please," Alan said, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart was trying to tear through her chest. "She's 5 years old. She has a heart condition. She needs surgery today. Please don't hurt her." The man holding Clara laughed, the sound wrong and jagged. "That's the whole point. Rayburn took everything from us. Now we take everything from him." "She's not his," Alan said desperately. "She's mine. She has nothing to do with any of this." The man with the gun moved closer, his eyes hard. "You're his now. Everyone knows it. Saw how he burned the city down for you. So your kid? She's leverage." He gestured toward the window with the gun. "You're coming with us. Both of you. Nice and quiet, or we throw her off the roof and take you anyway." Alan calculated the distance between her and the man with the gun. 7 feet. Too far. Calculated the distance to Clara. 12 feet. Impossible. Her daughter's irregular heartbeat would be spiking right now, the stress potentially triggering the very failure the surgery was meant to prevent. "Okay," Ellen heard herself say. "Okay, I'll come. Just let her breathe. You're scaring her and her heart can't take it." The alarm started then, a piercing wail that meant someone had finally noticed the breach. The man with the gun cursed, and in that moment of distraction Ellen moved. Not toward the gun. Toward the panic button Rayburn had installed beside Clara's bed after the basement, the one he'd shown Ellen with instructions she'd prayed she'd never need. Press it and every guard in the estate would converge on this room. Press it and seal the floor, trap everyone inside until Rayburn could respond. She slammed her hand down on it as the man with the gun turned, his weapon tracking her movement. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Ellen felt the bullet pass so close to her head the air displacement was like being slapped. Then she was diving for Clara, for the man holding her daughter. No plan except get Clara away from him, get between them and her. She crashed into him as he was turning toward the window, toward escape, and all three of them went down in a tangle of limbs and Clara's terrified sobbing. Ellen clawed at the man's face, at his hand over Clara's mouth, animal instinct overriding everything else. He released Clara to deal with Ellen, his fist connecting with her already damaged ribs, and the pain was white-hot and absolute. But Clara was free. Clara was scrambling away, and that was all that mattered. The door exploded inward, the lock simply ceasing to exist under the force applied to it. Marcus came through first, gun drawn, two other guards flanking him. Then Rayburn, and the expression on his face was something Ellen had never seen before. Not the terrible calm. Not the empty stillness. This was rage stripped of all pretense, raw and visceral and utterly without mercy. He took in the scene in a glance. Clara huddled against the far wall, crying. Ellen on the ground with a man's fist raised to strike her again. The shattered window and the rappelling line and the second man trying to bring his gun around toward Rayburn. Rayburn moved like violence given form. He crossed the distance to the man with the gun in 3 strides, caught the weapon before it could aim, twisted. The sound of breaking fingers was distinct even over Clara's crying. The gun clattered to the floor. Rayburn drove his elbow into the man's throat, a strike precise and devastating, and the man went down choking. The one who'd been hitting Ellen tried to run for the window. Tried to escape up the rappelling line. Marcus shot him in the leg, the report another deafening crack in the enclosed space. He fell, screaming, the line swaying uselessly above him. Rayburn was at Ellen's side then, pulling her up, his hands running over her with barely controlled urgency, checking for wounds, for blood, for damage beyond what was already there. "Are you hit?" His voice was rough, stripped down to something fundamental. "Did they hurt you?" Ellen shook her head, couldn't speak, could only point to where Clara was pressed against the wall, her small body shaking with sobs. Rayburn looked at Clara, at the child who'd called him scary and hadn't been wrong, and something in his expression shifted. He moved toward her slowly, hands visible, non-threatening, and crouched down the way he had that first night. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to that quiet register. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. I promise." Clara looked at him with eyes too old for her face, traumatized and terrified and trying so hard to be brave. "They said they were going to throw me off the roof." Rayburn's jaw tightened. The only visible sign of the rage Ellen knew was burning beneath the surface. "They're not going to throw anyone anywhere. They're not going to do anything ever again." He held out his hand, that same gesture he'd used with Ellen in the bathroom. "An offer, not a demand. Come here. Let me check if you're hurt." Clara looked at Ellen, seeking permission. Ellen nodded, not trusting her voice. Watched her daughter take Rayburn's hand, let him lift her gently, check her for injuries with the same careful precision he'd used on Ellen. "Just scared," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at Marcus over Clara's head, and the order was implicit. "Take them to the safe room. No one gets near them. No one." Marcus nodded, already moving to usher Ellen and Clara out. But Alan stopped at the door, looking back at Rayburn, at the two men bleeding on the floor, at the shattered window that had almost cost her everything. "What are you going to do?" Rayburn looked at the man with the broken fingers, the one who'd been choking but was starting to breathe again in shallow, pained gasps. "I'm going to find out who sent them. Who knew about the surgery. Who gave them the floor plans and the timing." His voice had gone cold, that terrible calm settling back over the rage. "And then I'm going to make sure the Vane Syndicate stops being a problem permanently." Alan should have looked away. Should have taken Clara and gone to the safe room and let Rayburn do what he did in basements and back rooms and places people didn't talk about. But she met his eyes across the ruined room and said, "Make it hurt." Because they'd put their hands on her daughter. Because they'd terrorized a 5-year-old girl who already had enough fear in her life. Because Alan had spent 2 years being invisible and powerless, and she was done with both. Rayburn's smile was terrible and beautiful and full of dark promise. "I was planning to." Alan nodded, took Clara's hand and let Marcus lead them to safety. Behind her, she heard Rayburn give orders in that flat voice, heard the men on the floor start to beg, heard the door close on whatever came next. And she held Clara close, feeling her daughter's irregular heartbeat against her chest, understanding that this was what protection looked like in Rayburn's world. Not gentleness or safety or peace, but absolute, uncompromising violence directed at anyone who threatened what was his. And Clara was his now, just like Alan was his. The city would learn that lesson in blood, one broken body at a time, until the message was clear. You don't touch what belongs to John Rayburn. Not ever. Not if you want to keep breathing. Clara's surgery took 6 hours. Alan spent every minute of it in the private waiting room Rayburn had secured, pacing the marble floors until Marcus gently suggested she sit before she collapsed. Rayburn sat in a leather chair by the window, perfectly still, his phone in his hand but his attention somewhere else entirely. He hadn't left since they'd arrived at Mount Sinai. Hadn't gone to deal with the aftermath of the hostage crisis or the dismantling of what remained of the Vane Syndicate. He'd delegated it all, staying beside Ellen in that terrible liminal space where the only thing that mattered was whether a 5-year-old girl's heart would keep beating. When the surgeon finally emerged, still in his scrubs, Alan couldn't make her legs work. Rayburn stood, his hand finding the small of her back, steadying her. "The surgery was successful," the surgeon said, and Alan's knees buckled. Rayburn caught her, held her up, let her sob against his chest while the surgeon explained about recovery times and follow-up appointments and all the technical details Alan couldn't process through the relief that felt like drowning. 3 days later, Clara was moved from ICU to a private recovery suite that looked more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital. Flowers arrived hourly, sent by people Alan didn't know, associates of Rayburn's paying respect or seeking favor. Marcus stationed guards outside the door, discreet but unmistakable. Alan slept in the chair beside Clara's bed, waking every hour to check the monitors, to count the steady, regular heartbeat that no longer stuttered and skipped. On the 4th day, when Clara was sleeping peacefully and the afternoon sun painted the room in gold, Rayburn asked Alan to take a walk with him. They ended up on the hospital's rooftop garden, a space reserved for donors and board members, empty except for them and the city spreading out below like a kingdom. Rayburn stood at the railing, looking out over Manhattan, and Alan wondered if this was how he saw the world. As something to be controlled, territories to be claimed, pieces to be moved on a board only he could see. "The Vane Syndicate no longer exists," Rayburn said, his voice carrying that familiar calm. "The last of their operations were absorbed or eliminated 48 hours ago. The men who came for Claire gave us everyone we needed. It's over." Alan processed this information, understanding what eliminated meant in Rayburn's vocabulary. "Good," she said, and meant it. Rayburn turned to face her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "I had my lawyers draw up documents. Clara's medical expenses are paid in full. Your debt, all of it, the payday loans, the hospital bills from your mother, everything. Erased." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, held it out. There's also a cashier's check for $2 million. Enough to start over anywhere you want. New city, new identity if you need it. You and Clara can disappear, be safe, live whatever life you choose. Alan stared at the envelope like it was a weapon. What's the catch? No catch, Rayburn said, but his voice had gone quiet in that way that meant this mattered more than he wanted to admit. You didn't ask for any of this. Didn't ask to be seen by me, didn't ask for me to burn the city down for you, didn't ask to watch me become the monster you always knew I was. He held the envelope steady, his hand not shaking but something in his eyes betraying the control he was fighting to maintain. This is me giving you a choice I should have given you from the beginning. Take the money. Take Claire. Leave. Be invisible again if that's what you need to be safe. Alan looked at the envelope, at the promise of freedom it represented. $2 million. Enough to move across the country, enroll Clara in the best schools, live a quiet life where gang wars and basements and men with guns were just things that happened to other people. She could go back to being a ghost, but this time by choice, with enough money that she'd never have to scrub blood from anyone's clothes or count pennies for medicine or work 20-hour days until her body forgot what rest felt like. It was everything she'd been fighting for. Everything she'd sacrificed her invisibility to achieve. And Rayburn was offering it to her with no strings, no demands, no expectation of anything in return except that she'd be safe somewhere he couldn't touch her. And if I stay? Alan asked, her voice steadier than her hands. Rayburn's jaw tightened. If you stay, you stop being the woman who cleans my house. You become the woman who stands beside me. You become visible not just to me but to everyone. Every enemy I have will see you as leverage. Every ally will see you as a way to get to me. You'll live in a world where people break into your daughter's room and men bleed in basements, and the price of protection is eternal vigilance. He took a step closer and Alan could see the war happening behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to keep her and the part that wanted to let her go for her own good. You'll be mine in every way that matters. My partner. My equal. The woman who can tell me to make it hurt and mean it. His voice dropped to something raw and unguarded. The woman I would burn the world down for over and over, until there's nothing left but ash and us. Alan looked at the envelope again, at the escape it represented. Thought about Clara sleeping in a hospital bed with a fixed heart and a future that no longer had a countdown timer attached to it. Thought about the apartment in the South Bronx with the broken radiator and the life of exhaustion and fear and endless grinding poverty she'd been living. Thought about being invisible again, safe in obscurity, a ghost who'd learned to survive by never being seen. Then she thought about Rayburn's hands buttoning her shirt with impossible gentleness. About the way he'd crouched down to talk to Clara, making himself small and non-threatening despite being the most dangerous man in the city. About the year he'd spent protecting her from shadows, moving pieces to keep her safe while respecting her pride enough not to make her feel like charity. About the basement and the blood and the terrible intimacy of watching him exact payment for her pain. About the kiss that had tasted like promise and threat in equal measure. She thought about who she'd been and who she was becoming, and the space between those two versions of herself that felt like crossing a chasm with no way back. I spent 2 years being invisible, Alan said finally, her eyes meeting Rayburn's. I was good at it. Really good. I could disappear into any room, become background noise, something people looked through instead of at. She took the envelope from his hand, felt the weight of it, the freedom it represented. Then she set it down on the stone railing between them. But you saw me anyway. You looked at the invisible girl and decided she was worth protecting. Worth watching. Worth stopping a city for. She moved closer, close enough to see the flicker of hope and fear warring in his expression. I don't want to be invisible anymore, John. I don't want to run to some new city and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if being safe is worth being alone. Rayburn's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with that careful tenderness that contradicted everything else about him. You understand what you're choosing? The danger, the violence, the life where peace is a temporary condition between wars. Alan smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd worn since the loading dock, since everything changed. I watched you torture a man in a basement and I didn't run. I told you to make it hurt when they came for Clara. I stood in your war room and watched you freeze a city. She covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. I understand exactly what I'm choosing. The question is, do you understand what you're getting? Rayburn's smile was slow and devastating, the kind of expression that made her understand why people feared him. A woman who's survived things that would break most people. Who's strong enough to watch the monster and not flinch. Who loves her daughter enough to make deals with the devil if it keeps her safe. He pulled her closer, his other hand settling at her waist, claiming and protective at once. I understand perfectly. And I'm never letting you go. Alan rose up on her toes, ignoring the protest from her healing ribs, and kissed him. Not carefully this time, not mindful of injuries and healing. But with the certainty of someone who'd made a choice and meant to live with all its consequences. When they pulled apart, Rayburn rested his forehead against hers, and his voice when he spoke was rough with something that might have been relief or triumph or simply the weight of getting something he'd wanted for longer than he'd admitted. Welcome home, Ellen. She looked out over the city, at the kingdom he commanded through fear and violence and the kind of protection that came with a body count. Thought about the penthouse waiting for them, about Clara healing in a hospital bed, about the life that stretched ahead filled with danger and power and the terrible, beautiful intimacy of being seen by someone who would kill for you without hesitation. Home, Ellen repeated, tasting the word, finding it fit better than she'd expected. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood the woman who'd chosen the monster, the violence, the dangerous protection of a man who'd frozen a city just to see her safe. The woman who would become the Iron Boss's queen, standing beside him in the light instead of hiding in the shadows. The woman who'd learned that sometimes love looked like blood and basements and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened what was yours. Alan Lisbeth had been invisible for 2 years. But now the whole city would know her name. And anyone who forgot it would learn the hard way why you didn't touch what belonged to John Rayburn. Not if you wanted to survive what came next. The announcement came not as words but as presence. Alan descended the steps of the Rayburn estate at precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, when the city's underground held its breath between the commerce of day and the transactions of night. She wore a dress the color of arterial blood, custom-tailored to fit her frame, with a neckline that revealed the fading bruises on her collarbone like badges of survival. Her red scarf, the only color she'd allowed herself for 2 years, was gone. She didn't need it anymore. The entire spectrum belonged to her now. Rayburn waited at the bottom of the steps, immaculate in a black suit that probably cost more than Ellen's old apartment. But it was the way he looked at her that made the assembled crowd go silent. Not as the cleaning woman. Not as the victim he'd avenged. As his equal. His chosen. The woman who'd survived his world and decided to claim it. He offered his arm and Ellen took it, her hand resting on his sleeve with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood. Marcus opened the door to the armored SUV, and they slid inside, the leather interior smelling of money and controlled danger. The restaurant was one of those places that didn't advertise, didn't need to, where reservations were made months in advance and the clientele consisted of people who shaped the city from smoke-filled rooms and hushed conversations. Rayburn had reserved the entire second floor. Alan recognized the power move for what it was. This wasn't dinner. This was a coronation. They climbed the stairs to find 20 tables occupied by the architecture of the city's underworld. Crew bosses and syndicate heads, the men who controlled territories from the waterfront to Harlem, from the Diamond District to the industrial wastelands. Men who'd built empires on violence and cunning and the kind of respect that came from fear. Every one of them stood when Ellen entered the room. She felt their eyes cataloging her, assessing, calculating. The cleaning woman who'd been beaten in a loading dock and become the reason John Rayburn had frozen an entire city. The woman for whom the Vane Syndicate had been systematically erased from existence. The woman who'd chosen to stay when given the chance to run. Alan met their stares without flinching, understanding that this moment would define every interaction that came after. Show weakness now and they'd spend years testing her. Show strength and they'd remember why their world had stopped breathing for a week. Rayburn guided her to the head table, pulled out her chair himself, a gesture that in this room carried more weight than any crown. He remained standing, his hand resting lightly on Alan's shoulder, and the room waited. "Most of you know why we're here," Rayburn said, his voice carrying that familiar quiet that made men lean forward to hear. "Some of you were inconvenienced when I shut down operations to find the men who touched Ellen. Some of you lost money. Some of you questioned the decision." His hand tightened slightly on Alan's shoulder, not possessive but protective. "Let me be clear about something. Alan Lisbeth is not my weakness. She's my line in the sand. Anyone who touches her, anyone who threatens her or her daughter, anyone who looks at her wrong answers to me." He paused, letting the words settle. "And you've all seen what answering to me looks like." The silence that followed was absolute. Alan could feel the weight of it, the understanding passing through the room like electricity. This wasn't just about her. This was about Rayburn drawing boundaries around what belonged to him and daring anyone to cross them. A man at the second table stood, older, with silver threading his temples and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. Alan recognized him from somewhere, from the edges of her invisible life, someone she'd seen coming and going from the estate. "Castellano," he said, his accent thick Italian. "You want us to accept that a cleaning woman sits at the head table?" The room held its breath. Alan felt Rayburn go still beside her, that dangerous stillness that preceded violence. But before he could speak, Alan stood. Fully. Deliberately. Let every eye in the room find her. "I was a cleaning woman," Alan said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I scrubbed blood from Mr. Rayburn's clothes. Polished floors in his house. Moved through his world like a ghost because that's what survival looked like." She looked at Castellano, saw the challenge in his eyes, the test. "But the Vane Syndicate didn't beat me because I was a cleaning woman. They beat me because I worked for John Rayburn. Because hurting me was supposed to send him a message." She moved around the table, Rayburn letting her go, trusting her to handle this. "They wanted to prove he'd gone soft. That his protection didn't extend to people like me. That I was disposable." She stopped 3 feet from Castellano, close enough to see the calculation in his expression. "Instead, they proved that touching anyone under his protection costs everything you have. Your operations. Your territory. Your life." Alan's smile was sharp enough to cut. "I'm not asking you to accept me because I cleaned floors. I'm telling you to accept me because I survived what your world threw at me and chose to stay. Because I understand what power costs in this room. Because I stood in a basement and watched John Rayburn dismantle a man piece by piece, and I didn't run." She held Castellano's gaze. "Can you say the same?" The older man stared at her for a long moment, and Alan saw the exact instant he decided. Saw the shift from challenge to acknowledgement, the recognition that she wasn't prey pretending to be a predator. She was something else entirely. Something that had been forged in violence and debt and the kind of desperation that either broke you or made you unbreakable. Castellano smiled, the expression genuine, and raised his glass. "To Ellen Lisbeth," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "The woman who survived the Iron Boss and decided he was worth keeping." The room erupted in response, glasses raised, voices echoing the toast. Ellen returned to her seat, her legs shaking with adrenaline she couldn't show, and felt Rayburn's hand find hers under the table. His grip was tight, almost painful, the only indication of how close that moment had been to going badly. "Well done," he murmured, so quiet only she could hear. The dinner proceeded with the kind of careful choreography that happened when powerful men gathered. Business discussed in euphemisms, territory negotiations disguised as small talk, alliances forged over wine that cost more than Alan used to make in a month. And through it all, Alan sat beside Rayburn, visible in a way she'd never been before, fielding questions and challenges with the same survival instincts that had kept her alive through 2 years of invisible labor. When they finally left, stepping out into the Manhattan night with Marcus and 2 other guards flanking them, Alan felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her shoulders. She was no longer the cleaning woman. No longer the victim. She was the woman who stood beside John Rayburn and made the city's underworld acknowledge her as his equal. "They'll test you," Rayburn said as they drove through streets that belonged to him through violence and fear and careful cultivation of respect. "Every one of them will look for weakness, for proof that you don't belong." Alan looked out the window at the city glittering below them, at the kingdom she'd just claimed a piece of. Thought about Clara sleeping safely in the penthouse, her fixed heart beating steady and strong. Thought about the basement and the blood and the choice she'd made on a hospital rooftop. "Let them test me," Alan said, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence Rayburn used when making promises he intended to keep. "I've survived worse than anything they can throw at me. I survived being invisible in your world. Now they'll learn what happens when I decide to be seen." Rayburn's smile was proud and dangerous and full of the dark promise that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Welcome to your kingdom, my queen." Alan Lisbeth, who'd once counted pennies for her daughter's medicine and scrubbed bloodstains from the clothes of monsters, looked at the city spreading beneath them and understood that she'd traded one kind of survival for another. But this time she wasn't hiding in shadows or disappearing into corners. This time she stood in the light beside the most dangerous man in Manhattan and dared the world to come for her. The invisible girl was dead. Long live the Iron Queen. And the city that had once ignored her would spend years learning to fear her name, whispered in the same breath as John Rayburn's, a warning and a promise. Touch what belongs to them and discover that some debts are paid in blood systematically without mercy, until the only people left breathing are the ones who understood the lesson. You don't touch the Iron Boss. And you definitely don't touch his queen. If you made it this far, you've just witnessed Alan Lisbeth's transformation from invisible ghost to the Iron Queen of Manhattan. The cleaning woman who scrubbed blood became the woman who ordered it spilled. The mother drowning in debt became the queen of the city's underworld. The invisible girl became impossible to ignore. But this is just the beginning. Don't let this story disappear into the algorithm. Hit that subscribe button right now and join a community that understands that the best stories aren't afraid of the dark. They dive straight into it. Subscribe for more dark romance that doesn't apologize. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when power, danger, and desire collide. Drop a comment telling me, would you have taken the money and run or stayed to become the queen? Because here's the truth, Alan's story isn't over. The city knows her name now. But there are always new threats. New challenges. New enemies who think they can take what belongs to the Iron Boss and his queen.